On Contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome to On Contact. Today we discuss the assault against leftist Latin American governments with the Ecuadorian Foreign Minister, Guillaume Long.
It's about building a new state, a democratic, modern state that's sovereign, that's accountable to its own people, that's not just serving the interests of a tiny little elite and foreign powers. And that's what we've been doing, and I think we've been largely successple at this.
On Contact, neoliberalism is patriotism. Truth is not. Socialism, counterweight, class war, corporate coup-d'etat, utopian ideology of neoliberalism revolts en masse. On Contact with Chris Hedges. Left-wing governments and politicians in Latin America are under assault from international bankers and corporations, as well as the CIA. The mechanisms that have seen populist leaders in Brazil and Argentina removed from power and the governments of Ecuador, Bolivia, and Venezuela destabilized have led Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa to warn that the region is faced with a new version of Operation Condor. That's the CIA-backed program to destroy leftist movements in the 70s and 80s that resulted in the disappearance or assassination of thousands of people. RT correspondent Anya Parampil looks at how Ecuador's offer of political asylum to the Wikileaks founder Julian Assange set it on a collision course with Washington.
Julian Assange. The name is synonymous with whistleblower or traitor, depending who you ask. He first got our attention back in April of 2010 when his organization Wikileaks released the now famous collateral murder video, which showed an Apache helicopter airstrike conducted by the United States in July of 2007, resulting in the deaths of multiple Iraqi civilians and 2 Reuters journalists. In July of that year, Wikileaks released the Afghan war diary, comprising of over 90,000 documents related to the war. Just 1 month later, Swedish prosecutors issued an arrest warrant for Assange in order to question him about alleged sexual crimes. Later that year, the Justice Department under Eric Holder announced it was investigating Assange under the Espionage Act for his publication of U.S. government documents. At this point, Assange was in the UK, where a court ruled the country would extradite him to Sweden for questioning, and he's put under house arrest. And on June 19, 2012, Assange entered the Ecuadorian embassy in London, announcing he was seeking political asylum in the country. By August, his request was granted by Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa, who said the Wikileaks editor could stay in the embassy indefinitely. And with Scotland Yard saying it's prepared to arrest Assange the moment he steps foot outside, it's where he remains to this day.
Guillaume Long is Ecuador's Minister of Foreign Affairs and Human Mobility. He was previously the Minister of Culture. He earned his doctorate from the Institute for the Study of the Americas at the University of London. And he called a few days ago at the United Nations for the creation of a global tax regulatory agency to force tax-dodging corporations, which the IMF estimates cost developing countries more than $200 billion a year in lost revenues, to pay the fees they owe to developing countries for the natural resources they extract and the trade and financial deals they often fail to make public. He has also demanded an abolition of tax havens where the world's elite hide their money to avoid taxation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let's begin 10 years ago. We saw the rise in Argentina with Kirchner, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, Lula da Silva in Brazil, challenging free trade agreements, pushing through social programs, eventually Evo Morales in Bolivia, and of course the president of Ecuador, Rafael Correa. This was a moment, those of us, and I spent 6 years in Latin America, a moment of hope when we thought that they had broken free from the chains of American imperialism and corporate power. Describe to me that moment, what they did, and then I want to talk about the reaction and the efforts to destroy the progress that's been made.
Well, I think we have to start from the terrible damage caused by neoliberalism in Latin America, particularly in the 1980s and 90s. Neoliberalism, or in the United States, is sometimes called deregulation. I think neoliberalism is more complete because there's an ideological component to it. But neoliberalism was very harmful to Latin America.
And it was shoved down the throats of these countries by the IMF, primarily,
yeah,
right?
It
and the World Bank.
It started with Pinochet in the 1970s, and then in the 1980s, democratization in Latin America was permitted because the Cold War was won, but it was conditioned on, economically towing the line of the neoliberal ideology, and it was terrible. I mean, neoliberalism, I would argue, from my left-wing perspective, is bad in most contexts. It's been bad in Europe and in other parts of the world. It's kind of dismantled the welfare state. But in a context where you already have a weak state, where the institutions are not really consolidated, where there's still kind of strong feudal remnants, such as in Latin America, where you don't really have a strong social contract with institutions, with modernity, with some neoliberalism just shatters any kind of social pact, and it meant more poverty, more inequality, huge wave of political instability. In Ecuador, before Rafael Correa was elected in 2007, between 1996 and 2006, that decade, we had 7 presidents. Now that we're back talking about impeachments again, we had 3 impeachments processes in 10 years. A huge banking crisis in 1999. We lost our currency because of neoliberalism.
Well, they did switch to the dollar, right?
We switched to the dollar. Several 100,000 Ecuadorians left the country because of their assets, where the current accounts were frozen. It was bad. It was bad in Argentina in 2001. It was bad in Bolivia. It was terrible. You had the water wars, and a number of Latin America hit rock bottom. So we, I think, realized that as our peoples came to terms with that moment of their history and decided to rebuild their societies and to fight foreign interventionism, I would say even imperialism, tackle what the main issue is still to this day in Latin America, which is inequality. Latin America is not necessarily the poorest continent in the world, but it certainly is the most unequal continent in the world. And a lot of Latin America's problems, structural problems, have to do with that inequality. If you look at the kind of obscene wealth living side by side with total squalor in shantytowns, that's very much a feature of Latin America, which is also one of the most urbanized, contrary to stereotypes.
I used to live in Miraflores in Lima, which looks like Miami with barbed wire on the walls.
Sure.
But you're exactly right. 10 blocks away, people are living in pueblos jóvenes drinking poisoned water from sewer systems.
That's exactly right. So I think that's what it was all about. It was about the recuperation of the nation state, the refoundation, in our case, of a democratic Republican state project, moving away from neoliberal fundamentalism, it's kind of deregulation in an already deregulated environment. It's just anarchy, and that's what it was all about. And in that kind of anarchy, the powerful people, the people with power, with wealth, have even less checks and balances on their power.
And we should be clear that throughout most of Latin America, the internal security forces, when I covered the war in El Salvador, there were 3 different branches of the police who were running death squads at night. But they serve as a kind of Praetorian guard for the oligarchic elite. That's why they exist. And they are riddled with, various officials who work directly for the CIA and U.S. intelligence. I know that's been that was a problem in Ecuador, and I think a few years ago, was it President Correa got rid of his intelligence chief, his joint chiefs, precisely for that reason.
Oh yeah, we've been seriously infiltrated throughout our history by particularly the United States, but probably other powers also. It's about building a new state, a democratic, modern state that's sovereign, that's accountable to its own people, that's not just serving the interests of a tiny little elite and foreign powers. And that's what we've been doing, and I think we've been largely successful at this. It depends how you're going to measure success. If you're going to measure it in terms of longevity and how long these governments were in power, and in our case we still are in power, of course, and we're going to win in February next year, then you're looking at more or less, depending on what, in Venezuela it's been maybe 17 years. In Ecuador now 10. Even in Argentina it was 13. In Brazil 13. If you're going to measure success in terms of political success, it was very successful. And if you're going to measure success in socio-economically, it was very successful too. Major reduction of poverty.
Well, you fought the trade agreements.
Yeah.
You got rid of the military base in Ecuador.
We did, yeah, the U.S. military base in Manta in 2009.
And Correa had a great line. He said, you can keep it, he's telling the Americans, but we just want a base outside of Miami.
Yeah, no problem with keeping it, but we want a base in Miami. Unsurprisingly, the offer wasn't taken upon. But no, I think right now there's a whole kind of spin on the issue that it's the end of the cycle. We can discuss that. But I think, broadly speaking, these Latin American processes were successful. They reduced poverty, they reduced inequality, they asserted sovereignty, and it was very important for the world, because one of the critiques that's often aimed at the left generally is that, they're very well-meaning, they're good people, they have great ideas, but don't let them govern because the country will go bust. Now, in Ecuador, we had really healthy growth rates, 5% a year, lots of good economics, we diversified our economy, we moved away from, we were just like importing 80% of our energy, now we're net exporters of electricity. Big reform in education, higher education, lots of things that you would, that are economically successful, and left-wing economics being successful, whereas neoliberal, right-wing, orthodox economics was not successful in the previous decade. I think that's a very important lesson.
Successful for global corporations, who, and I think one of the things you've been pointing out is the way that these corporations can not only extract natural resources without any they'll pay off local elites. I remember interviewing the president of the Congo once, and the big French oil concern is pumping all sorts of oil. He had no idea the amount. He couldn't even tell you the amount of oil they were taking out. Yeah.
That's not our case. Yeah, we've really. I mean, in terms of oil, we even changed the contracts. We're an oil producer. Ecuador's an oil producer. We produce about 530,000 barrels of oil a day. So I know the amount. But we were getting 20% royalties, on multinationals' extraction of oil. Now it's the other way around. We pay multinationals a fee for extraction, and we had to renegotiate all the oil contracts in 2008, 2009. Some multinationals refused to abide by the new rules of the game and left the country, and so our state oil company moved in and occupied the wells. But most multinationals said, okay, we'll do it. It's still profitable, and so now it's the other way around. We pay private companies to extract the oil, but the oil is ours.
And you were a Minister of Culture before. I
was, yes. I've been in a few ministries. Yeah.
Right. And from what I read, there was a huge expansion within the educational system.
Yeah, I was also Minister of, it was called Knowledge and Human Talent, basically in charge of university reform, which is well known. Ecuador's university reform is well known throughout Latin America, because it gave a huge leap in terms of quality and in terms of inclusion of previously excluded people from higher education, so indigenous people, what we call Afro-Ecuadorian, African Ecuadorian people, who are now being included in the university system, and fighting neoliberalism. We had a phenomenon in Latin America where you would open a university on every street corner. We call them garage universities, where you pay quite a lot of money and you get a degree by the end of it, and there's virtually no tuition involved. And so we closed those down, which again, a phenomenon of neoliberalism.
University.
something extremely linked to deregulation, which proves that the market doesn't regulate everything.
That's right. When we come back, we'll hear more from Ecuador's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Guillaume Long.
Hillary Clinton, bad judgment. Let's defeat her.
A man you can bait with a tweet is not a man we can trust with nuclear weapons.
She is their puppet, and they pull the strings.
We will not ban a religion.
We don't want them in our country.
We will not build a wall.
A great border wall, believe me. USA, USA.
Want to know what's going on in your city, in your streets? Never back down like Tyrell, and the truth is what you seek. To analyze, investigate from the bottom to the top. You speak your mind like Sean Stone, whether they like it or not. I got Tabitha, Miss Wallace, with the wisdom and the pearl. Between the outrage and the evidence, what's going on in this world?
Watching the hawks, watching the hawks, watching the hawks. Listen when they talk.
Earlier today, President Obama
Senate Republicans previously stated that the component responsible for poisoning people in Flint.
there is always hope.
That's what goes
Trump
on
is
in
making a lot of noise.
What are women supposed to do? Here's something else we know.
Between the U.S.
Lawyers
and
at
Cuba.
the ACLU have already some degree of loss in
It's a
business.
huge difference.
Following the announcement, oil prices.
Nobody's talking about this story because it's garbage.
Real, genuine, and significant change.
I'm Tom Hartman, and I'll give you what the mainstream media can't, the big picture.
There's been no charges filed in
And when you question more, you find what you're looking for.
This is the legislative branch of the parliament.
We'll go deeper, investigate, and debate, all so you can get the big picture.
On contact with Chris Hedges. Welcome back. We continue our conversation with Ecuador's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Guillaume Long. So let's talk a little bit quickly about the kinds of measures, some of which you mentioned before, that angered multinational corporations and Washington, which essentially uses its political and military power, projects that power to protect the interests of those corporations.
Well, we don't really know for sure what, exactly what all the repercussions of our acts, because some of the things are visible, but some things are less visible.
Sued
Chevron, Texaco.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think you've taken that case to The Hague. This is 15 years you've been trying to collect for damage and destruction of the ecosystem in the Amazon, where they were drilling from oil from, the early 70s to 1990 or something like that?
That's right. Yeah, the original case against Chevron Texaco, Texaco, which was then bought by Chevron, was actually not made by the Ecuadorian state. It was made by people who were affected by one of the greatest oil spills in the history of humanity. 85 times the size of the British Petroleum oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. I think 18 times the size of the Exxon Valdez Alaska oil. 18 times in the Amazon. The difference being that it wasn't accidental. It was on purpose in order to cut costs. Because they were in the middle of the Amazon, normally what you do is you extract the oil and then you have these pools where you have some oil and you have membranes so that it doesn't filter through into the ground. They didn't put these membranes, and so the oil filtered into the water systems, polluted all the Amazon River system, and created a huge obviously a sanitary issue, a public health issue for people with lots of cancers that were detected and so on. So it was actually the people who sued Chevron Texaco. Now, they didn't particularly appreciate the fact that the Ecuadorian government, for the first time when we came to power, actually took the side of, without getting involved in the judicial case, but seriously condemned the actions of Chevron Texaco. So I think Chevron Texaco has probably got a lot of, we know it's got a lot of, it's all very murky, but they have a lot of lobbying power in the United States, in Wall Street, in Washington, and so on and so forth. So you don't really know what the consequences of your actions are when you're being...
the Dulles brothers having financial stakes in United Fruit.
That's right.
And therefore overthrowing our Benz in '54.
So probably there are a lot of things we don't see, but we don't benefits we could reap, investment, all sorts of things that we could get that we don't get because we've been sovereign. And in the case of the Manta Air Base, we'd like to think the American government understood and that it was fine. But you know, it was a bold move. We said no more. We declared it in our new constitution. 2008, we had a new constitution, which was a vibrant moment of our history. We created new rules of the game for our country. It's one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. It actually declares the rights of nature. It's the only constitution in the world that declares the rights of nature, not just the rights of man. And anyway, in the constitution we made Ecuadorian territory free of foreign military bases. So we had, you know, there was no other way. But all these things, yeah, sure, and there are consequences to your actions.
Well, I just want to quote President Correa, who has accused the CIA of, quote, being increasingly involved in the political opposition with the avowed aim of dragging the country into chaos and weaken the Ecuadorian government by a series of coordinated nationwide protests. You have had some very close runs, including in 2010, with an attempted coup, if I can use that word, by the Ecuadorian police. You have recently closed down a group that is funded by AID, supposedly to protect the rights of journalists and promote democracy in...
It wasn't, in the end, it wasn't closed down. But yeah, I mean, sure, I think that there are new ways of intervening in
But we
in
saw
states.
in Brazil, isn't this the,
lots of
new tactic?
Lots of fundings to NGOs, lots of kind of funds to promote democracy. When we're actually, you know, we just had 10 elections in 10 years, where like everybody celebrated our electoral system, saying that it's, you know, it's really fail-safe, that it's the excellent democratic practice, so on and so forth. But anyway, they have all these funds so that NGOs can kind of have, you know, stimulate civil society and all that. And obviously a lot of the money usually ends up in the pockets of opposition groups, right-wing groups. So, you know, where it comes from different origins. It comes from the NED, it comes from yeah, sure. I mean, this is something you have to live with when you decide that you're going to have
President
build a
Correa has
sovereign
actually
country.
referred back to Operation Condor, which rose, I think it was led by the Chileans, but it was this consortium of intelligence chiefs which led to the disappearance or murder of thousands, if not tens of thousands, of labor union leaders, students, activists, you know, left-wing politicians, and they'd be hauled off to Uruguay, and their torturers, you know, would be Chilean. I mean, this.
Yeah, I think there is an international conspiracy right now, maybe, certainly against the progressive governments, because there have been a few electoral setbacks. So in Argentina,
and we've seen Venezuela.
Venezuela's in a difficult.
Well, Venezuela's collapsing. I mean, in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, the media frames it in a certain way, but yeah, sure, Venezuela's facing serious trouble. So you know, there's an attempt in this present moment to make the most of the fall of the prices of certain commodities and just go for it and overthrow all these. So we just saw what we called a parliamentary coup in Brazil, and we think that's part of the strategy.
I commend you for walking out, by the way, when.
Yeah, I mean, these things are important.
Yeah, they are important.
Democracy is important. You can't play with it.
Yes.
She was elected with 54 million votes. The Partido de los Trabajadores, the Labour Party, the PT, in Brazil has been in power for 13 years, and the only way they managed to get rid of it and remove it from power was through a coup. They couldn't do it through universal suffrage. So, you know, these things are important. We've condemned it. Ecuador's taken a strong stand. They only had to, if she was so low in the polls, then they had to wait another couple of years and win in, you know, free and fair elections. You can't just topple a president when somebody's low in the polls.
We know from leaked documents why she was toppled, and we know the deep corruption within.
Well, this is the irony. The people toppling Dilma Rousseff, despite the fact that they didn't find a trace of corruption against her, the people toppling her are all facing huge accusations of corruption.
Was it 60% of the parliament or something in Brazil?
With massive corruption accusations. So I mean, you know, this is really cynical. And history's pretty tough on its judgment on those kinds of coups and those kinds of behavior. I mean, I think that this current time in Brazil, you know, it's good to take historic difference from events and just think, how will history remember this? And history will remember this as something really, really nefarious in Latin America's
We've also got
past.
to mention Ecuador's tremendous courage in giving sanctuary to Julian Assange, which sent the security and surveillance state in this country into hyperdrive. I mean, this was, that alone is going to guarantee tremendous pressure against.
Yeah, but that's another thing that probably means that we face repercussions. Yeah. I mean, we granted asylum to Mr. Assange based on a very rigorous reading of international law and institutions. Asylum is got a whole body of legal and normative backing to it, 1954 Caracas Convention, etc., etc. And one of the reasons why you give people asylum is if you have legitimate fear that there may be a case of political persecution.
Right.
And so we thought that there was a very legitimate case for political persecution. We still think there is. All the guarantees that we've asked for Mr. Assange not to be extradited from the United Kingdom for Sweden to a third country, we still
Well, we should be clear that
them.
what Britain has done is refuse safe passage to the airport.
That's right, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are some new developments. We'd been calling for 4 years for Mr. Assange to be interviewed in the embassy. The Swedish prosecution kept saying that's not possible, that's not possible. We knew that it was possible. Finally accepted to do it. So now we're going to have that latest development. So Ecuador was right all along. I think Ecuador's position has been strictly abiding to international law, to international conventions, and that's good. That's something we have on our side, and it's something that other countries recognize us for. But yeah, I mean, it's been tough on Mr. Assange. 4 years in a tiny flat with, you know, London winter light, no outside space whatsoever. Really tough on human rights. We talk about it all the time in the UN. You know, Mr. Assange's human rights have been seriously violated.
When we spoke before, you weren't quite as pessimistic as I was about where we're headed, but there certainly has been a rollback in Argentina. Sure. You had vulture funds bankroll the current president during his candidacy. You have seen the political reversal in countries like Paraguay. Evo Morales will not be running again. How do you see this moment? Of course, you talked about the essentially legislative coup d'etat in Brazil. How do you see this moment where we are now?
Yeah, undoubtedly there is a rollback process taking place. We knew all along that if we were going to go for democracy and more democracy, and if the left was going to leave kind of the revolutionary pathway, not in terms of what it does, but in terms of how it comes to power, then democracy, you know, eventually, a lot of us have been in power for 10 years, 15 years. Eventually it's going to happen. Power also has that kind of eroding effect. I mean, when you're in power for a long time, change is very seductive discourse, right? Change for what? That's a different question. But, so we knew that was going to happen. Now, I think what's important here is, and this is where I challenge the notion of an end of cycle in Latin America, is that I come from the left that had 3, 4, 5% in the polls, and all the major candidates were all right-wing neoliberal candidates. They were basically different factions of the oligarchs that were disputing power amongst themselves. This is not the case anymore.
Our elections.
This is not the case anymore. Even in places like Argentina, in places like Brazil, the main opposition force, in the cases where the left is out of power, in the case of Ecuador, we're still in power and we're going to win in February, but in the cases where the left is out of power, it's the main force. It lost with 49%. The neoliberal hegemony is not hegemonic anymore. You have a kind of strong disputed political ground between a traditional right and a radical left. And a radical left which has proved that it can reduce poverty, it can reduce inequality, it can run the economy well, it's got young cadres that have been ministers and so on, and I reckon sooner than later it will be back in power.
Great, let's hope so. Thank you.
Thank you.
That was Ecuador's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Guillaume Long. A few years ago, the anti-imperialist left in Latin America was ascendant. Luis Inácio Lula da Silva in Brazil, Evo Morales in Bolivia, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela won stunning electoral victories, instituted socialist reforms that benefited the poor and the working class, and they refused to be obedient puppets of the United States. These governments, like the government of Ecuador, fought to control their own resources and their own destiny. This progress is being reversed. corporate leviathans and the imperialist agencies that work on their behalf are reshaping Latin America into havens for corporate exploitation. It is the old story of the struggle by the weak against the strong, the poor against the rich, the powerless against the powerful, and those who would be free against the forces of imperialism. There are no boundaries in this struggle to the death. Ernesto Che Guevara said, "We cannot be indifferent to what happens anywhere in the world, for a victory by any country over imperialism is our victory, just as any country's defeat is a defeat for all of us." Thank you for watching. You can find us on rt.com/oncontact. Until next week.